right, let's jump into it. Quick introduction. I was a former U.S. Army Sergeant, which is a 74 Delta. We call that a Seaburn. I did 8 years. 3 of it was in South Korea, 3 was in Hawaii, and 1 was in Iraq with Operation New Dawn. I have 12 years or more. I've done 12 years of experience in QA, ranging from startups to Salesforce. I have about 10 years as an individual contributor, doing framework development, things like that, and then more than 2 years of management by now. Most recently was the QA and automation team lead at 90.io. I'm still with 90. I'm just moved to the SRE team lead. So basically started out on our onboarding pod where I oversaw 2 billing provider migrations, which were huge projects. I grew the team from 3 to 14 reports. Our unit test reporting and improvements, we went from about 20-ish% of unit tests to over 50% in this time frame that I'm sort of discussing here. It's better now. Smoke coverage is, we went from 0 to 100%. Regression coverage, we went from 0 to 95-ish%. We reduced our release time frame from every 2 to 4 weeks to weekly. And like I mentioned, I moved on to head of SRE delivery and SaaS ops. So some objectives, what we want to cover is essentially you want to start out with some terminology. There's a lot of different words out there. I just want to make sure that we're baselining. Talk about feature set coverage, code coverage, and UI coverage. Essentially, on each of those topics, I want to get on to how you go about achieving it, and then some lessons learned that we had in our journey. Get into some final thoughts, and then hopefully leave some time for Q&A. Let's see. So the terminology that we want to cover here, let's start with coverage, right? The exercise of understanding what is tested, and then usually that's via automation. A feature set, which is a collection of features your app provides, usually maintained by either product or QA teams, that helps everybody know what your app does, and it may include some form of a team or pod ownership. Code coverage and understanding of which lines or branches of code are tested generally applies to unit tests, but also may apply to Cypress tests, and we'll get into that. Instrumentation, it's the practice of modifying the code base under the hood to understand which lines or branches of code have been tested, generally used for code coverage. And UI coverage and understanding via the UI of which elements in the application have coverage. I know Brian did a great job of explaining all that already, but that's a quick recap. So feature set coverage. So that can be achieved in a lot of ways, but we mostly use Jira, right? So the first step here is to separate concerns, figure out a way to start categorizing your test scope and all the things you need to test. We chose to split things into what we call smoke and regression, right? So smoke is the main features of the app, our session critical tools, the create, read, update, and delete operations. So like your meat and potatoes, right? Regression is like the secondary parts of the app, like non-critical things that contain workarounds, corn and peas, bells and whistles, checkboxes, knobs, things like that. And it's important to remember that there's no right or wrong way to go about this. Just make up your own definitions that fit your organization. And the most important thing is to get started. So this is sort of like what one of our teams, the way we went about defining this stuff, and this might like an example of what this looks like. So we had various epics for, at the time we had like core tribe and people tribe and some other tribes, right? And then the core tribe, we had pods, core 1, 2, and 3 pods. For each of those pods, we decided to define a smoke and a regression suite for each of those feature set areas. And then in Jira, we created an epic for each of those. And then we had a bunch of, Jira issues or items that defined like the test cases that we wanted to cover or the feature areas that we wanted to cover. And then you can see there that right here that like we could point and prioritize those issues and then also track them. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The other big part of this is reporting. Make sure you're gathering KPIs and reporting weeklies, but be understanding of dips or outliers. Your coverage denominator can change rapidly in some organizations. So as you're like, oh, this pod just added a new feature, and obviously we're adding a bunch of test cases for that feature. So like that denominator just changed, right? So it's okay if there's like dips here week over week. You for gathering these kind of KPIs, like our app 90.io is amazing. We've got this awesome like scorecard section, which actually you can even just improve. Like this looks way prettier than it does now in this screenshot. But I recommend going and checking out our app strictly for like using this KPI scorecard. But you don't need our app to do something like this. You can do it in like Google Sheets or whatever. But track and measure, right? Set goals. So you see it. We set goals over time, and then make agreements that you're gonna meet those goals. So you can sort of see here that we have like a single pod. This is like our learn pod that did like a knowledge share tool. And you can see, like they very rapidly ramped up on all their smoke testing, and over time they brought their regression testing up to like the necessary levels. So some lesson learns on feature set coverage. It's more subjective than objective. Like you're relying on someone's imperfect interpretations of the app, right? Somebody like I think this, we got all these features. Maybe they miss some stuff. Maybe they forget things, right? So those things might not all make their way into Jira, and therefore they don't make their way onto that baseline or denominator, right? Large swaths of the app were left out of the picture. Like we weren't perfect. We missed a lot of stuff, constantly evolving. It was really hard to get a good baseline denominator, but we were okay with that, right? It took my team multiple quarters to do all the legwork, get the Jira tickets sorted out, point and prioritize them, etc. It's highly manual work, especially in like reporting. Many questions from other departments like design, product, or leadership on what exactly is covered. So usually you have to have that subject matter expert sort of go into that area and explain, yeah, we have coverage here or not, right? So it's difficult to parse and explore. People don't really like digging into Jira tickets to understand what coverage is and things like that. Really, it helps QAs and leaders understand our automation priorities. We had a part of our app called the one-on-one tool where you can do like one-on-one discussions with your reports. But in order to do that, we had to set up, a seat in the company, and then assign a person to a higher up seat and a lower down seat, and then that seat had to have a role and responsibility of a person and all this stuff. And then finally, you could get in to where you could create this one-on-one discussion and start testing that part of the app, right? Each of these different areas, including inviting different users into the app and things like that, these were all covered by different teams. So us understanding that, hey, your team needs to work on these features first to make sure that this other team over here has the ability to automate what they need to automate was a really great thing that came out of this, right? And it's hard to keep up with. So when your app starts to change, those tickets and things like that need to change too, which is more manual work. It's a great way to get started from nothing, like we did. We had no automation, so this helped us set our priorities and understanding what to automate, when to automate, things like that. But it's probably a lot harder to do this, in retrospect, if you already have a lot of automation in place already. Moving on to code coverage. So how to achieve it? There's a lot of tools out there, from free to expensive, that you can get a good picture of code coverage. We personally use Codehub.io. If you want to follow specific instructions, you'd want to follow the specific instructions for the tool that you use. My goal here is to show you how simple it can be to achieve some immediate results. So, for example, with Codehub.io, we just have we just use their Codehub action in our GitHub Actions, and that essentially, as long as we're already collecting coverage reports, which was already happening, right? Just sending those reports over to Codehub was super simple with this action, and that got us a lot of data. So how to achieve it? Let's explore what's happening in code coverage and how it may help you. So I'm going to present to you a super ridiculously simple breakdown of instrumentation, right? If you have a code block that looks like this with a branch in it, like an if-else statement. So we have something.length is less than 2. Do this one thing, right? And if not, do something else. So you can imagine instrumentation is doing something like this. It's under the covers, sticking something called like hit A in this branch and hit B in this branch. And then it calculates the total amount of hits that it should see. So that would be 2. And then the amount of hits that actually happened when it got into that branch. So that would count up to 1, and that would count up to 1. So if that became 2 of 2, you have 100% code coverage, right? It's way more complex than that, but that's a super simple way to sort of phrase it in your brain and to understand what's happening here. So you can with CodeCov, you can configure leverage so your PRs meet a certain bar before merging. So with CodeCov specifically, they have two concepts here, which is project and patch coverage. CodeCov is strong because I'm not sure if all tools do this patch coverage thing, but CodeCov definitely does, and it was one of the big reasons why we chose them. Project coverage is the overall coverage that you want to maintain. For example, if you wanted to ensure your directory didn't dip below 70% of overall coverage. And patch coverage is the difference between the last commit and your commit. So for example, if you wanted to ensure all new code has at least 50% coverage. And within that, you have these things called informational, target, and threshold. Informational is non-blocking. It just throws the information up on the PR and says, hey, you did this well. It just shows you the data calculations, right? It'll never block your PR or anything. Target is the goal you're looking to reach. So you should pick something achievable in the quarter. Say your code base is at 70%. You want to try to get to 80% by the end of the quarter. Set your target to 80%, right? It's that easy. And then you might want to set your threshold is a leniency in hitting that target. So at the beginning of the quarter, I might set my threshold to like 10%, and then I would slowly reduce my threshold over the quarter until I hit that 80%. And then I would start over the next quarter and do something like that. You can use maturity models to help people understand guidelines of how to progress their code coverage forward. But we'll talk about like why you should probably leave these things to the team. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's see. So here again, here's our KPIs. You can see, over this time frame. And I just went into our tool and picked like random time frame. So I'm not saying this is what our coverage looks like today by any means, right? This is like how you can see time coverage progressing over time in like our back end project or our front end project, and then you can see that essentially it breaks it down into directories, and you can drill all the way down into your directories, individual files, and see the percentage of those files are covered, and then you get like these wrap up views of like how each of your directories are doing, and that can help you understand where to go apply more code coverage or whatever, or where you have misses or things like that. So it's fairly traditional code coverage views that you get there. So far we've only really discussed adding code coverage to unit tests, and that might not get you like your entire picture. So what if your Cypress tests are contributing to code coverage, which they do, right? There's this really great talk or presentation here and under this guide called Code Coverage by Amir and Gleb, and that really covers how to get into to achieving that. If your substrate is set up to do it, I'd recommend you go for it. Ours wasn't really set up, but I'm still really interested in going and setting this up and getting these numbers for my own organization. Just hasn't happened quite yet. So some lesson learned, simply putting numbers in front of developers in a PR is enough to create continuous improvement in those numbers. We saw about 0.5% to 1% increase in unit test code coverage week over week just by putting informational in front of somebody and never blocking a PR, right? So I think that's pretty cool. With tools like CodeCov, you can set targets and thresholds that deny PRs if a certain bar is not met. You may not have as much control over unit testing in your organization, but I believe at the very least, getting the numbers in front of engineering leadership is a worthwhile and cost-effective endeavor. And so just understanding your data, right? Implementing a maturity model and giving teams goals to self-organize and teaching them to apply their own thresholds is a better model than dictating minimums or blocking PRs from high command, right? Don't implement a CodeCov tool, say like, you've got to reach 95% coverage all the time, and we're going to block your PRs until that happens. That is one way to just stop development in your organization. Put it in the hands of the teams. Show them how to use your tools, and have those teams implement those things, and you'll see that improvement happen. And then you can talk to your engineering leadership and say, hey, look, these teams aren't doing that stuff. We found that maturity improves when they are, things like that, right? Applying a holistic view of UI unit coverage may or may not be the correct solution for your organization. So do you want to roll those two numbers of UI and unit test coverage together somehow? And like, is that a good thing, right? That's up to you and your organization to decide. Basically, if you did have that holistic view of, hey, UI tests are covering these parts of the app, and unit tests are covering that part of the app, right? It can help you understand where your testing effort is best spent, right? But I'd say probably 99% of the time, follow the test pyramid. It's in unit tests, right? Put a lot of effort down there. It's important. And getting into UI coverage, how to achieve it. Like, this is obviously the simplest one of everything. If you're already on Cypress Cloud, you're running your test there, simply turn on the feature, you pay for it. And then the reports are instant, right? You can see here's, again, a snapshot of some time period and how we've improved over time with our UI coverage. We just do a daily run for all of our smoke and regression tests, and that's the report that we find most interesting. So you come in here and you can see that we were hitting 54% at this particular time frame, right? And then you can click on that, and it's sorry. Ooh, hold on, just got lost. Here we go. Yeah. So if you click on this run, right? You get into the run, then you can click on this UI coverage tab for that run. And then you get, again, like a pretty, like, what I really appreciate about UI coverage is it sort of follows that traditional view of coverage that you expect to see with unit test coverage. But instead of directory driven, now it's endpoint driven. So like, you can see that, like we're hitting 100% of coverage on our assessment endpoint or a headlines endpoint or our knowledge library tool, right? Like, and then you could drill into those areas and you can see what's tested and what's not tested. So here you can see that, we're never really testing different date formats, right? So that's an area we can improve. Or see this set time zone automatically button or checkbox we are not testing. So lessons learned. So when we see an auto-generated value for something in the report, it can be a tip-off that you might be missing a testing attribute like a data CY or something like, or a significant attribute that you define on a given element. And that can help you see where you need to add them in your code, maybe like your page object models or something. So you can see here in our survey tool, we are missing this back to surveys button. We also haven't added a data CY to that button, so we were probably not even thinking about testing it at all, right? So we could go add that data CY to our page object for that survey, back to survey button, create a test, and then get 100% coverage on that page. Let's see. Element grouping is a key concept to understand. Many apps have dynamic or data templating. So making good use of different grouping configuration options, such as by selector in a container or by wrapped input or things like that, is key to testing smarter. You don't always need to test every single element in a repeated grouping, and it's usually not worth the time to do so. So what I'm trying to explain here is we have this survey tool, right? It looks like this. You pick one of these options, and then you hit next, right? And then you go into the next page, and it's got 5 more options. You pick one, and then you hit next. And then so if I wanted to test every single one of these things across all 25 pages of this tool, that's going to be like, what is that, like 125 tests? One option doesn't differ from the other. It's a survey tool, right? So these don't change anything or do anything to the app. So what I can do is group all these together and say, well, as long as I picked one, I've tested all of them, right? That's the power of element grouping. So now we've tested all 25 pages of the survey tool with one single test, right? That can save you some costly test results. So another piece about configuration is auto-generated IDs and classes and filtering those out. So our app uses material, Angular material, and that can generate a whole lot of like these things called like mat MDC slide toggle 1. But for some reason, like as it generates, depending on the day or how it feels, sometimes this same element, this element and that element, right? They are tested, or it's tested in this case. But this day it just decided to call it mat MDC slide toggle 2 button, right? So, and then also, even if I added a data CY to this thing, UI coverage might see that this is a like some new element here and there and decide that it's not tested. So what I could do is add a data CY to this thing, make sure I'm testing using my data CY selector, and then exclude anything that starts with like, ID mat MDC slide or something like that. So this is what the configuration looks like to do some of those exclusions. And you can see that like we're excluding things that are like, mat, all, or mat classes with mat.all and things like that, right? So shared UI elements across pages can impact coverage percentages quite a bit. So automate those early, and they'll eliminate a lot of elements and lists when viewing reports across pages for your site or app. Start conservatively when using configuration features. They're extremely powerful. And if you go super generic and draconian, you'll be like, wow, like we just gained, 90% coverage and your app is not tested, right? It's just because you configured away views. It doesn't mean that those things are tested. So if you are configuring away custom attributes, make sure that you're adding like data CY or something like that to your selectors to ensure that then those pop outside of those things that you can configure away and get picked up as not tested, right? And then there's a lot of other really useful configuration options over here on at this link here, which I think they can drop for you. So some lessons learned. Due to the UI being so user-friendly, I found this is the best way to share an understanding of coverage with both engineering and product. We got only about 38% from tests. Keep in mind, we were like, 100% smoked and really high 90s of regression, and UI coverage was still like, yeah, you only have 38% of your test of your app covered, right? That was prior to configuration improvements. After we went in and started doing a pass with configuration, we ended up hitting 54%. We could probably gain another 5 or 10% via configuration if we go explore that more. The versatility of configuration actually gives you a better, clearer picture of coverage than instrumented code coverage for end-to-end tests. UI coverage is getting much more user-friendly. Configuration improvement in the future. I don't know about soon, but basically, from what I understand, is it's going to mostly be like right-click, pick some exclusion or whatever, and then that goes and fills out your configuration for you instead of having to understand, that JSON structure and what all those configuration options are doing for you, and then probably have some feedback on the UI as to like what's configured away or not, which I think will be super useful. And it's important to understand that 100% coverage is probably a fallacy. To ensure those expectations, but ensure that those expectations are known across the org, but especially by QA. What I'm saying is, I was super happy when I saw that we had 38%. And to me, 38% is like 100%, right? So make sure everybody knows that 38% is a failure number. It's a good number, just depending on how you feel about your organization coverage, right? Final thoughts. So I originally thought about taking this presentation and like listing pros and cons of each type of coverage. But I rethought that and I said, well, maybe you should be doing all of these things to some degree. You should care about unit test coverage. You should probably care about feature set coverage, especially if you're just getting started, right? And you absolutely should care about UI coverage. All types of coverage have benefits and give you data and understanding of the overall system. And this data is which allows you to find gaps to improve your reliability. My experience with beta testing the UI coverage feature the UI coverage team over here at Cypress Cloud was fantastic. Shout out to Peter. But the more we work with the feature and the more we learn and apply every day, I wouldn't consider this presentation comprehensive at all. But I hope it gives you some of your own ideas on how to tackle the subject. And finally, data is a superpower. If you're going to invest your time or money in attaining coverage, you should invest your time and money in measuring it. Having the data informs your organization's decisions on release processes and frequency. This data directly impacted our decision to move from releasing every 2 weeks to every single week. And it's helping us on our journey to multiple releases a day. And thank you so much for listening to my coverage journey and experiences. What questions do we have?
Thank you so much, Anthony. This talk was fantastic. Thank you for sharing your team's coverage journey with us. We're going to be bringing up a question from the audience here on stage, but during your presentation, you mentioned communication between a number of different teams within your organization. Did you see any major changes to communications between dev and QA groups throughout this process?
I mean, that's a big question. There were a lot of changes in general, and I would say throughout this process, this informed how we worked with QA in our organization. We started out as a sort of monolithic thing, and then we went to decomposed across teams. That definitely helped with communication, but also communication between QAs was a big thing that were embedded on those teams, helping somebody else understand, yeah, this thing is covered, but I need this thing to go like integrate with my feature, right? So that was a big help there.
Awesome. I'm going to bring up a question from our audience. What was the most difficult part of ramping up to get this coverage, and how would you handle that differently now?
The most difficult part of ramping up. I mean, honestly, because it was a fresh new QA team, it was like kind of a lack of that domain knowledge, and getting those QAs embedded to gain that domain knowledge and understand what needed to be tested was probably the hardest part. If you already are there where you have, you know, a QA team, they're embedded in teams, they understand what needs to be tested, you've just won half the battle, you know.
Awesome. We're going to take another question, and this one is for the feature set coverage. Where is the data coming from? Is it coming from Jira?
So I say that the data came from our app itself, right? Like what needs to be tested, and then like I sort of mentioned with the last question, having the QAs embed to understand what needed to be tested, you know, and then filling that stuff out into Jira, let us sort of come up with the feature set. Sometimes organizations, product teams already have a feature set. They're like, you know, there's all these products, there's these bells and whistles on this feature. These things belong to these teams, blah blah blah. You know, that's a great way to get started if it exists. If not, it sort of gets home built through like as we ended up doing it through like Jira tickets, right? And like I said, it was imperfect. We missed large swaths of the app because of the state we were in and the learning we were doing and stuff. You know, so sometimes, you know, you just learn new stuff about your app every single day. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, I have another question for you from the audience, and I'm going to share that to the screen now. I think it'd be interesting to talk about this from your perspective, because I can give the Cypress answer, but the question is, who is the primary intended user of UI coverage? QA engineers or developers? So Anthony, from your perspective, how would you answer this question?
I'd say, I think that all organizations should get to a posture where development is doing QA, where QA essentially ends up becoming maybe a centralized team that's enabling development, and everybody is doing QA. So to me, the primary intended user is always developers, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think this particular feature set is really interesting because I do think it has applicabilities across teams, and the very visual nature of it lends itself to allowing folks who are not in the code base every day to get deep insights into, you know, what you have coverage on, and not have to dig through spreadsheets and do a lot of manual calculations to get there. So I agree with you there. All right, folks, that is bringing us to the end of our session. Thank you again, Anthony. The information you have provided is amazing, and we really appreciate you sharing this with us today.